Check. There we are. That's audio. Okay. All right. So first of all, I appreciate everyone taking some time to join us this morning. Quick icebreaker. It's a funny story. At least I think so. Last night I was doing some prep for this presentation, right? And got home late, got the kids to bed, had dinner with my wife and everything. And I fell asleep doing prep work. And I woke up this morning, and my wife said, "You realize your presentation put you to sleep, right?" I'm sure you'll do fine, you know. Like, thanks for that, you know, encouraging, getting out of the gate. What I thought I'd do is kind of a three-part session here today. Part one, just a couple kind of overview thoughts for the agency. So if anyone's new to DISA, right, or you haven't interacted much with us, I think that'll help maybe set the stage and frame what it is we do and deliver to the department. Step two, we're going to walk through a section I like to call Follow the Money. As a former CFO type, right, that registers with me, but we always say a budget is a good roadmap of your priorities. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the strategic plan that we talked about last time we were at AFCEA in the fall time frame, and show you how we have in fact aligned resources with some key areas within the agency and the department to drive that plan forward, right? So it's not shelfware, it is real. And then third, and perhaps most importantly, folks in the agency know I like to talk with people, I like to interact. So rather than me just talk, what I thought we'd do is some Q&A, much like we did in the first session. If you get your questions in, I believe we have someone from AFCEA who will be able to ask those. If not, we can bring folks up. But I'm open to any and all kinds of questions, and we'll just kind of have a dialogue and make it a little more interactive, if that sounds good to everyone. All right? Okay, next slide. All right, so I'll spend a hot minute here. You know, one of the things that's interesting to me when new folks come into the agency, almost to a person, they remark at some point, "I am shocked by the depth and breadth of the agency's mission." It's really hard to get a good feel when you're maybe in the military services or another part of DoD or even sometimes in industry for the scope and scale of what it is that DISA is involved in. So I'm going to hit on a few key things here. I will by no means hit on them all for the agency, but figure I'd try to give you guys a good sense of the kind of core mission set that we're delivering. So first off, I think what's foundational to what DISA does is we operate what's easily thought of as kind of the superhighway of communications for the Department of Defense. So global network, right, global agency. Everything from terrestrial, on land, and undersea fiber optic cables to gateways that allow us to downlink data from space, right? That is the department's information superhighway, and it is joint and it is interoperable across the department, which means everyone's using it, right? And when you think about that network infrastructure, I like to think of it in two ways. In one sense, it's for business purposes, right? All of our classified and unclassified email, our voice, video, data kind of communications, video conferencing, those kind of day-to-day things that you think of in any normal business travels over that infrastructure. But it is actually classified as a weapons system in the Department of Defense. And it is, I say classified, not secret classified. It's, categorized, better word. But it is categorized that way because it also is a no-kidding warfighting network. So things like ballistic missile defense, connecting a sensor to a shooter site for things that maybe MDA does. Working with intel partners, working with things like AISR traffic, right? You talk about drone feeds overseas, right? Those capabilities are being operated over this backbone, and we're disseminating those video feeds across the department to warfighters in real time, right? So really easy to think of in two ways. Same network supports both mission sets. So on top of that, we have 11 core data centers, right? So riding this information superhighway, we have all this resiliency built in. We also operate these on-prem data centers, you'll hear them referred to as, where we have everything from, again, business applications to no-kidding warfighter applications. So the application that actually distributes all of that ISR traffic across any subnet user in the department is hosted in our data centers. Increasingly, that's becoming more of a hybrid environment where we have on-prem solutions, but we're also pulling in the commercial cloud, right? You hear about that a lot in DoD. We're shifting in that direction. And DISA is a major enabler of cloud activities across the department. So not just the actual cloud contract, if you will, but we facilitate the access into those environments in today's world through cloud access points and security capabilities that we have in place. I'll highlight as well contracting and acquisition. We run the Defense IT Contracting Organization, many of you are probably familiar with. Several $1 billion a year from the department goes through that organization, gets put on contracts with industry partners, small businesses, et cetera. And they have really the IT and the telecommunications expertise that maybe others in the department don't have from a contracting perspective. Cybersecurity, right? So everything I've sort of described from a network operations perspective, from a data center perspective, an application hosting perspective, right? We have to not only operate that, we have to secure it. And so we'll talk a little bit in here about something called Project Thunderdome, which is our adoption of Zero Trust for the department. And that is a major component of obviously everything we think about. And then, like I said, we'll touch on that going forward. Some of the other things you see on here, collaboration, C2, part of the portfolio, command and control, is the first thing I'm going to touch on when we move on here. Number one priority for the agency is how we do C2 for the department. And that means a number of different things, a number of different people, and I'll dive into that as we press forward. Next slide. Okay, so last time I was up on stage in, I believe it was October at AFCEA, we talked about two kind of key things that were happening inside the agency. One, we had a lot of leadership change, right? I remarked at the time we got a lot of old people that left, a lot of new people that came in, and we reorganized the agency, right? So we had this interactive process within DISA where we engaged a number of stakeholder groups. We really took feedback on what the organizational design should be to drive unity of effort, speed of information flow, right, enable communication and kind of the velocity of action that General Skinner's talked about. And so we reorganized in October. I'm proud to report we've made it a full 6 months. We have not reorganized again, so I don't have to talk about that again. But in doing that, we also laid out the strategic plan at the last AFCEA event, right? 5 key lines of effort. I'm going to shape my presentation here today on those 5 lines of effort and give you some insight into, again, follow the money, where we're investing dollars in each one of those portfolios. But those 2 things were very much synergistic in that new organizational design is designed to deliver on these capabilities as we press forward. With that, I will jump to the next slide. Okay, like I said, follow the money. The budget is a statement of priorities, right? I'm not going to get into the detailed, millions here, millions there kind of thing. But I do want to give you a sense that everything I'm going to talk about was the result of some sort of resourcing decision within the department or agency over this past budget cycle. And so we're really talking FY23 and forward. These are the things that we've prioritized. And then to further organize that for you, I'm going to prioritize in terms of the lines of effort in our strategic plan. Go to the next slide. Okay, prioritize, command, and control. Number one thing in the strategic plan, number one thing that the director and I think about when we walk in, I say every morning we get a 6:45 a.m. ops update. One kind of umbrella, I'll say concept or construct that I want to kind of lead in here with is JADC2, so Joint All-Domain Command and Control, right? Everybody's heard it. It's a bit of a buzzword in some cases. But if we decompose that a little bit, what does it really mean? One, it's joint, right? When you think joint, got to think DISA. Like I said, we run that joint interoperable superhighway over which most, if not all, of the data under the JADC2 construct is going to be transported from a processing center to an end user, right? Without that infrastructure, what's the point, right? And so when you start thinking about C2, right, command and control, we think from President of the United States all the way down to the foxhole. So we'll talk senior leader communications in a minute, but those direct orders, right, starting at the very top of government all the way down to the warfighter, who's no kidding on the front lines, all relies on DISA infrastructure for that to work. So a couple key concepts, and I'll kind of take this in a hierarchical kind of fashion. Resiliency. So, when we talk JADC2, you'll hear a lot about combatant commands wanting to use AI and ML, right? Run algorithms, get data to the warfighter that's meaningful and actionable sooner in a relevant time frame, basically, is the way they'll describe it. To do that, you've got to have resiliency in the network infrastructure, right? In other words, what good is all that AI and ML if you can't get the data to who needs it to actually act on it? And so one of the areas that we are heavily focused on is making sure that we've got resilient infrastructure, again, land, undersea, space, et cetera, in all of the right feeders, right, in the right places to facilitate that kind of data exchange. Performance monitoring. It's an interesting one in that, we talk a lot about DevSecOps and wanting to build a pipeline where we think about security up front, right? When we're starting development, we don't bolt it on in the end. And increasingly inside the agency, one of the things we're keying on is building in the performance monitoring and the censoring up front as well, right? Because ultimately, what we do not want is the Secretary of Defense or General Skinner or myself as the censor, right? It's not a good day for Mr. Means ops guys when I call the ops floor and say, hey, something's not working, right? They want to know about that before I call. And to do that, we've got to have good censoring and performance monitoring in place. So we're starting to kind of change the paradigm of how we think about that. And then lastly, senior leader communications. You hear General Skinner talk about this, right? We want to provide the gold standard in communications for our senior-most leaders. DISA is providing the national level comms for the White House, for the Secretary, the Deputy Secretary, the Chairman, right? All of the key players in government who have to make decisions and have to do that in a timely fashion. And they need to have the absolute gold standard in order to make those decisions and be effective in leading the nation. And so when you package all of these things together, it's sort of a pyramid in the sense that you could reverse the order and say, from senior leader comms, to facilitate that gold standard, we got to be resilient. We got to always be on. It's another way of saying that. And to make sure we're always on, we got to know the environment. As General Skinner said in his opening keynote, we've got to be able to see ourselves so that we can assure that those senior leaders have what they need. Okay? Next slide. All right, driving force readiness through innovation. This is a good one. There's some weighty stuff on here. Mobility. Again, you heard in the previous discussion where we're talking about one device. How do we simplify things? And one, I'll say, prompting question for industry out there, in our view, is how do we make DoD mobility just like me going to, say, the Apple Store or to Samsung or pick your vendor, right? But that kind of user experience where I get the phone, I can set it up, I can do it myself, and I'm off and running. And not just for the unclassified world, right, but for classified mobility. So if you think about how we've shifted over the last, say, 2 years in the pandemic, we've gone... We back? Cool. Brief interruption. We've gone from a workforce that is mostly on-site, right, to one that is highly distributed, to where you may have 50, 60, 70% of a workforce outside of a DoD facility. And in doing that, you've seen a growth in our secret mobile devices from maybe 1,500 to 2,000 up to 6,500 plus of those devices out in the world, and something similar at the TS level, although in smaller numbers. And increasingly, the department is looking at how do I leverage that capability, not just if I'm at home, but when I'm traveling or traveling internationally, et cetera. And the challenge in the industry is how do we provide that user experience such that even in that secured world, it still feels like I'm using my regular phone, right? That's what the senior-most leaders ultimately want in that space. When we talk about automation, I think about speed and velocity. And so just to use kind of an analogy, think about the speed of information flow in the world today, right? 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I would not be standing here. I know that. I'd be a lot younger. But we didn't have Twitter, right? We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have information moving, with the crack of your fingers kind of a thing. And in today's news environment, right? Who tunes into the 7 p.m. world news to figure out what happened during the day? Not as many people, right? Most people are on Twitter, they get on Facebook, or they're online, right? And it's quick. Automation, same concept applies. We have that kind of information, right, and data flowing through the network at a massive scale. And the only way that we can possibly sift through the noise and get to what really matters is by automating. And I think that applies kind of in two senses. One, in the business sense, right? We have our own processes within the agency and the department that to the extent we can automate, we become much more effective. But it's also from a security and mission perspective, where automating the security, orchestration, and response type activities, right? You hear about SOAR and things like that, is going to be critical given the amount of information flowing over DoD's infrastructure. SIPRNet of the future. Steve Wallace is going to talk a little bit about this, I think, in some of the other sessions. But when you think about DoD networks, a lot of times we tend to focus on NIPRNet or the unclassed network, right? A lot of times industry's on that infrastructure as well. It's kind of the first thing we try to get accredited, right? Get new products out there, et cetera. And sometimes that can be to the detriment of SIPRNet. And so within the agency and across the department, there is a very focused effort to look at, how do we modernize our existing classified infrastructure? How do we bring industry to bear with their capabilities on that infrastructure to facilitate that modernization? How do we consolidate the architecture, make it less disparate and more of a singular environment? Because that is the network we fight on, right? When we talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and what's going on in theater with UCOM and company, it's SIPRNet, right? Talk about PACOM, talk about US STRATCOM, those things. All those kinds of communications and the real C2 of the department occurs on that fabric. And so that's a deliberate attempt on our part to prioritize that within the department moving forward. Next slide. Okay, leveraging data as the center of gravity. I'll say that the kind of nirvana end state for the agency would be that single pane of glass kind of view of all the data that we have at our disposal, right? Whether that's realistic, debatable, right? That's where we need partnership with industry to bring solutions to bear. But I'll tell you that we have a massive amount of data at our disposal, both internal agency data, but also because we're an enterprise provider for the entire department, right? Just think what that means. We have 4 million users connecting into our superhighway, right? Accessing our applications that we host, et cetera. And that all creates data. Every transaction creates data. And the question is, how do we operationalize that? How do we make it relevant so that the director of the agency, commander of U.S. Cyber Command, right, senior leaders can actually use it to make decisions in real time? We made a lot of progress, I'll say, over the last 18 months. 18 months ago, we didn't have a chief data officer at DISA. We now have that. We have a team stood up, again, part of the organizational design that I talked to earlier. And we've really placed an emphasis on establishing that office, looking internally at how do we catalog our data, right? How do we tag it? How do we make it more consumable and usable across the enterprise? And that's a journey. I'll tell you that one of the things I've challenged our CDO with, a lot of times, in my experience, right, we talk a lot of policy when we talk data, which I think is necessary, but I have a bias towards action, right? It's more of a show me something kind of mentality. So for those in industry who are thinking about, what they can bring to this fight, I think if we can start with certain use cases and demonstrate relevance, right, that has a snowball effect. We gain some momentum and move the agency and the department forward in that sense. Policy's necessary, just don't love dealing with it, right? Want to go do something. Next slide. Okay, harmonizing cybersecurity and the end user experience. So a couple things in this space. I think there's a session going on now. There might be a few others on Thunderdome. Was certainly all the rage, I think, last time at AFCEA, right? We moved out with this OTA. But Thunderdome is about, at its core, fundamentally shifting the security paradigm of the Department of Defense. We talk about zero trust and those kinds of things, and Thunderdome was really born from leadership challenging folks within DISA and the department on what does it really mean to implement zero trust. What are the core concepts and capabilities we've got to put out there, and how do we bring those to bear for the broader enterprise, to move away from some of the layered defense in depth that we've been used to over the years and more to an assume breach mentality. And if you assume breach, well, then I don't want to trust anyone or anything until I verify positively that they and their device can access the information that they need to get to, right? And so that's really the strategic intent of Thunderdome. It will be, once it comes into full fruition, I believe the largest transformation of security and network architecture in the department, probably since we moved to the Joint Regional Security Stacks in the 2016 timeframe. But it's a reimagining of all those things, and for that reason is a major priority of the agency and the department. Unified endpoint management. So what do we mean there? A couple of things. One, I think General Skinner in his wouldn't it be cool if discussion, said we just had one device, right? What if I didn't have a laptop and an unclassed device and then a classified device and a desktop, right? So this is an effort within the agency of how do we better manage and unify or consolidate down to less devices for the end user. Many of you know we operate DoDNet, which is intended to be the kind of single network for the fourth estate over time here. And the question is very real in our mind of, do we need to give everyone a laptop and a phone and all the other devices that you're used to having, or can we do less and do more with less? There's a second component of this effort, and that is how do we optimize the performance of that endpoint, whatever it might be. In varying parts of DoD, right, you get a sense of frustration off of some of the performance on endpoints. And it can be a whole host of things, as General Skinner said. It can be all the capabilities we're running on the endpoint. It could be the application you're accessing. It could be the network, right? But what we want to do is simplify as much as possible the endpoint so that we narrow down, I'll say, the potential causes of that frustration at the end user level to something that's more manageable and ultimately results in a better end user experience. Okay, next slide. Almost had it. There we are. Okay, empowering the workforce. LOE 5, but arguably right up there with C2 as one of the key things we've got to do, right? Within the agency, we talk a lot about how do we grow our bench, right? And I think this is probably not dissimilar from what some in industry go through. But how do we establish programs, policy, or structure the agency such that we're bringing in and infusing talent, right, even at the lower levels, and then building that up through the agency and providing that pipeline. And so we've placed quite a focus on that within the agency, targeting a certain percentage of our billets, for example, to be ladder positions to facilitate bringing people out of school or from industry or where have you, right, to try to get them into the agency and then trained up on all things DISA, and then hold on to them and retain them. We've established a number of developmental partnerships as well, so we're working with academia in a number of areas, establishing centers of excellence, things like that, again, to, one, impact curriculum, and then build pipelines of that talent into DISA. Related to that, we talk a lot about strategic program assessments, or SPA days, right, which we came up with as kind of an evil euphemism because they are anything but relaxing and enjoyable. But the intent there is to go line by line through the agency, put the agency through the paces, so to speak, and really make sure that we are aligning our limited resources, I'll say, to the right priorities. And that's some of what we're highlighting here is these are the areas where, as I said earlier, over the last cycle or so within the department, we have pushed resources in alignment with our overall strategic plan. So with that, I'll go to the last slide here, and then I will get to questions. Okay, bottom line, driving change, right? There's not a day that goes by that I don't try to challenge the status quo on something, possibly much to the chagrin of other senior leaders in the agency. Prioritizing resources, right? Like I said, I've got a financial background. We have limited resources. We got to make sure they're going towards the right priorities. And ultimately, it's about bottom line of delivering capability to the warfighter and supporting our senior leaders. So with that, I will pause there and I will take questions if you want to come up to the mic.
Tim Flynn, Intel Corporation. You mentioned JADC2, and the services are converging. Army's got Project Convergence, Air Force Advanced Battle Management, Navy Overmatch, covered Marine Corps as well. How is DISA functioning in that arena? Is it a uniting function? How are you leading? And who's got that badge pinned on him at DISA?
So Colonel Finch, who I don't know if he's here today, but he is the lead for DISA as an agency. But we are plugged in predominantly through the Joint Staff, and we actually lead the cross-functional team on transport, and that's one of the areas I was highlighting earlier as DISA playing a critical role. But if you start to look at the key lines of effort, or priorities under JADC2, I won't get the number right off the top of my head, but you can basically read DISA right after them, right? So while the services each have their own efforts, I would say DISA is in many cases the fabric that ties it all together. So whether it's a transport, whether it's data, whether it's enterprise, ICAM identity type capabilities, we play a significant role in each one of those spaces, and are heavily participating in the cross-functional teams, right, to try to bring it all together. We're happy to get you Colonel Finch's contact info as well. So. Might be better.
Sir, with the pandemic, how has that changed how your recruiting strategy? You talked capabilities of endpoint devices, and how does that all play together, especially when we're all competing for the same resources in both commercial and government?
Yeah, so I think we've tried to, even with the pandemic, right, continue outreach, even if it's virtual, to academia, for example, to try to bring in kind of the newer folk, if you will. We've looked at how we can expand beyond, say, USA Jobs to advertise positions. I think there's some research out there, and I'm looking at Lori, she doesn't have a mic, but that talks to how younger folks in particular do not go to USA Jobs, right? That's not how they are kind of programmed to hunt for a job. And so we're trying to think through, okay, well, how do we catch their attention, right, in accordance with all the regulations and things we got to follow. I'll say that from an agency operations perspective, right, we kind of flipped the switch on being on-site to off-site overnight. And I would argue didn't really miss a beat in doing it. Now, over time, right, new people come in. One of the challenges becomes, whereas we had some existing relationships before and we could leverage that, some of that attrits away. So how do you bring new folks into the fold and make them feel a part of the team? We do that through a number of different forums, some of which I operate, some of which others, provide. But making people feel like they're part of the team, I think, and part of the culture is key once they're in the agency to keeping them and retaining them. So that's some of the things we've done. But it's been a challenge, there's no doubt.
Ken Wright, Broadcom Software. This is more of a comment than a question, and I'll start with, wouldn't it be cool if? So I just wanted to say that. But in the spirit of some of the requirements around end user experience, end user monitoring, we see these requirements within programs. So a good example is Zero Trust Architecture. But we also see the broad requirement across the enterprise. And what I envision, the art of the possible, I see DoD, DISA embracing capabilities from a program perspective, but you could already have capabilities for enterprise end user experience within Transport Directorate, that could be leveraged across programs, but I don't see acquisition and requirements that way.
So I think to comment on that, one of the things that we've talked a lot about in the agency, particularly since this restructuring occurred, is how cross-cutting many of our initiatives are. And, to your point, right, Transport Directorate operating this enterprise infrastructure has a lot of capability that they can bring to bear. And are we having the conversations across organizational boundaries to make sure that that's known and that we can bring that to bear to drive the agency forward? So we've been moving more in the direction, Thunderdome's a good example, of these cross-functional teams where we will not get to a perfect organizational design where you never have to step outside of your directorate, right, and everything's self-contained. One of the things I've been messaging to folks is the communication across the agency is critical to everything we're doing because it's all interrelated. And so to your point, right, those kinds of conversations I think will start to yield benefits in terms of making sure we're maximizing the capability that we already have, already paying for, et cetera, as we press forward.
Yeah, hi, Don, sir. Roy Flores from Air Force JWIX. I have a question. Earlier you were mentioning about how DISA utilizes, the RQs and how you connect the inner circuits of that. Right now you guys utilize SIPNet. Is there any way ahead for JWIX?
So JWIX is an interesting conversation. So DIA is actually the program manager for JWIX. And while that may ride DISA Transport, they ultimately own the architecture, I'll say. So it would be outside my purview to comment probably further on kind of what their roadmap looks like, other than to say we support them and complement them is probably the best way to think about it. Everybody wants the chef to get up here? The AFCEA guys were joking with me. They said the chef is only 10 minutes after you, so we're not trying to rush you, but get off the stage, basically. I get it. Okay. One more?
Yeah. Dennis Edens from Duke Tech Solutions. Can you speak on behalf of the 4E&O program and where they're at and what your current challenges are?
Sure. So 4E&O, or Fourth Estate Network Optimization, for those who aren't familiar with the acronym. First of all, intent, right? We're directed under IT reform to consolidate the unclassified and classified networks in Phase 1, 13 defense agencies and field activities into one classified, one unclassified network. One service desk, one overarching contract for buying, I'll say, commodity IT end items. And so we've onboarded DTIC. We're onboarding DPAA coming up here in the next few months. I know there's an acquisition outstanding called Defense Enclave Services, so I will not get into that only because it's an ongoing activity right now, and I don't want to get in trouble with our general counsel when I get back. But I think in the broadest sense, it's an activity that's moving forward. I will say that I think it's key that we retain the momentum of migrating and consolidating this agency infrastructure over the next 12 months or so. As we bring on larger and larger agencies, that becomes more and more, I say, critical for the department and for DISA. But that's kind of where we're at in the movie right now. We do have more agencies on the service desk contract at the moment, and that was always the plan, to migrate some of those ahead of the actual network infrastructure. But DPAA is next out of the gate in terms of moving on to the capabilities. Other questions? Intel wants to jump back up? Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate the time.